Hi, everyone. It's Lisa from Been There, Got Out. Today's guest, I'm very, very excited about. I found him, actually, one of our clients told us about him during one of our support groups. Oh, there he is. Okay, great. All right, Josh, I see you. Let me, Legal Abuse Support Group. Hey, you should check out this guy's stuff. And I immediately got his book, which is behind him and very good. Dr. Josh Coleman, it worked. It's called Rules of Estrangement because our community is full of people that are dealing with high conflict separations, divorces, custody battles, and co-parenting hell. And unfortunately, in these situations, especially difficult divorces, something occurs where one parent tries to turn the kids against the other parent. And so I read the book. I know it's for adult children, but I thought it was really, really useful. And so much of the information I thought could help a lot of people in this community. So thank you so much. I'm like, Josh, Dr. Coleman, okay, for agreeing to come on. But before you even introduce yourself, something that you said in the book really stood out to me that I think a lot of people dealing with this issue can relate to. And that's that when you lose a child, when a child stops talking to you, if it were a death, that you'd have a whole community of support rallying around you. But when it's a situation like this, where a child just stops talking to you, it's the opposite. Instead, it's like there's all this shame and judgment. Can you talk about that a little bit more and then introduce yourself?
Sure, of course. Yeah, I know for if your child dies, as incredibly tragic as that is, and I'm not saying that they're equivalent, but there are rituals that we have in the society, and there are various kinds of support and lots of books written and religious organizations that can rally behind you to support you to at least soften the pain of it. You may still blame yourself. You may still feel, terrible about it. You will feel terrible. But with an estrangement, um, there aren't typically the kinds of supports that there are with the death of a child. And if anything, people don't really want to talk about being estranged from a child, young or old, because people just assume that, well, you must have done something terrible for your child to have turned against you. Kids don't just turn against a parent for no reason. And that's somewhat true, but children can turn against a parent for all kinds of reasons that don't have to do with bad parental behavior. So that was really my point.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so now can you officially introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Joshua Coleman. I'm a psychologist in the San Francisco Bay Area, specializing in parental estrangement and alienation. I've written 2 books on the topic. I've been doing webinars on the topic for the past 15 years or so, and also do a free Q&A every other Monday at 11:30 a.m. Pacific. And so I've been really steeped in this topic for a long time. And yeah, so it's just there's lots of really terribly depressed, sad, scared parents out there who are struggling with this.
Yeah, yeah. I always say this is one of the most common issues in our community, and I'm talking about the alienation part. So speaking of that, can you talk about the difference between alienation and estrangement?
Yeah, I mean, I differ a little bit with people who research this because they make the distinction in the following way. For them, they say, well, alienation is when a parent, typically the other parent, poisons a child against the other parent. That's a real thing. And estrangement is when the child doesn't want to see the parent because of bad things that the parent is doing. And the reason I don't think that that's a good distinction is that, I mean, I would consider that, I might call it a justifiable estrangement. But estrangement in general, in both psychological and sociological research, is used in a much more general way to signify the end of a relationship or the cutoff of that kind of thing. So when I use the term estrangement, I'm incorporating alienation. To me, alienation is a subset
Mhm.
of estrangement. I just problematic the way that some researchers call estrangement, what I would call justifiable estrangement, when everybody else talks about estrangement is just a general cutoff or ending of a relationship. So, yeah.
Yeah. And how does divorce, is there some relationship between divorce and these kinds of behaviors where kids stop talking to a parent or they don't want anything to do with a parent?
Well, yeah, divorce is huge. In my survey of 1,600 parents who were estranged from an adult child, 70% of them were divorced from the other parent. So we know that divorce is a huge factor. One, because it can cause one parent to alienate the child. And that can be true of any age. You don't have to, the children don't have to be minors to be successfully alienated. You know, if the kids are adults, and what we now call gray divorces, those divorces that happen when the parents are more in their 50s, 60s, and above, a parent can still blame the other parent for the divorce. They can make allegations of the other parent that can alienate the child. So you don't have to be a young child to be successfully alienated. But it isn't just that. It can also be that the child independently blames one parent over the other, even if the parents have a successful divorce and separation and don't blame the other one. It brings in new people into the family that the child has to compete with, young or old, step siblings, half siblings, romantic partners of the parent that the child may not like, or they may not like the child. That can be a cause of estrangement. In a highly individualistic society like ours, it can cause the child to see the parents more as individuals with their own strengths and weaknesses, and less as a family unit that they're a part of. So divorce is really an incredibly common pathway to a later estrangement.
Yeah, I know a lot of times in our community when this starts to happen, whatever we want to call it, where the child turns away from one parent, that parent feels awful and they say, I don't know why my child is aligning with this other person. And I know something you also talked about in your book is that divorce can cause a child to worry more about the emotional well-being of one parent over the other, and that might cause a shift toward or away from that parent. So it's not necessarily that you're again like a bad parent, right? Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to think of children, particularly young children, as being like, you know, they occupy a certain kind of ecological niche in a family, and they want to maximize what is sort of helping them to survive psychologically. So they may figure that allying with one parent over the other is going to be more helpful to them. That might be one reason, but it may also be that the child feels like that parent really needs them to be in more alliance. So, for example, one recent study said that something like 1 out of 4 dads today are estranged from a child, but they're 22% more likely to be estranged from daughters are 22% more likely to be estranged from a father than sons are. So there's kind of an alliance that can happen between mothers and daughters. I mean, I have tons of mothers and daughters in my practice, so it's not like it always works out that way.
Mhm.
But there may be ways that daughters may feel more identified with their mothers, or more, they may feel more sympathetic to them. So that can be a factor as well. Who the child identifies with, generally speaking, kids tend to identify more with the same gender child, but in general, dads are much more at risk than mothers are.
Yeah, but something that you also talked about in your book was how a child's rejection toward is different for women than for men. Why is that?
Well, it's painful for both, but for mothers, the identity of motherhood is so powerful that for mothers, it's harder for them to kind of compartmentalize it in the way that many fathers can do. So, you know, in general, the research shows that men tend to be more externalizers when they have hurt or upset feelings, meaning that they're more likely to blame, get aggressive, deny, defend, that kind of thing. Whereas women in general, much more likely to be internalizers, meaning they're much more likely to internalize with self-criticism, anxiety, depression, yeah, internalize the painful feelings with guilt, sorrow, regret. So those gender differences can really play out in how they respond. And I think part of the reason that more dads are estranged than mothers is that I think dad's natural reaction, which is to be more defensive or aggressive, or, you know, you can't talk to me that way, or, you know, you need to respect me. It just doesn't work once an estrangement starts to be put into place, whether it's through alienation or some other mechanism.
Yeah. Another thing that stood out to me that was so fascinating that you talked about was the lack of community in our day and age versus the past. How does that impact our relationship from our kids, and especially in terms of what we expect from our kids versus how it used to be?
Well, I think, you know, there's been this tectonic shift in the past half century in terms of what kind of people think about in terms of family and family obligations. You know, the for millennia, the idea in family was honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, families forever. In the beginning, in the 60s, we became much more preoccupied with individual rights, mental health, personal growth, autonomy, individuality. And those are really the elements that constitute today's parent-adult-child relationships. So the mistake that I often see parents making when their child starts to complain about them, about their childhoods, about how the parent treated them, etc.,
Yeah.
uh, that they may say, "Oh, you're disrespecting me. I gave you a great childhood. What are you talking about? That's not emotional abuse." And the adult child, they've been raised with in their culture that these kinds of behaviors are emotionally abusive or traumatizing, etc. Or more importantly, that they should be protecting their mental health. That includes from their own parents. Then that's when conflict can begin, because you have these very different ideas about what family relationships are kind of constituted upon. So the British sociologist Anthony Giddens talks about in modernity, we shifted from a role, kind of a well-defined role that people should play as parents or as children, into what he calls pure relationships, meaning relationships that are purely constituted on the basis of identity and personal growth and happiness. So given that, nothing compels an adult child today to have a relationship with that parent beyond that adult child's desire to have that relationship. And that means that parents have had to become much more psychological, much more self-reflective, much more careful than prior generations of parents.
Yeah. I was thinking also about in terms of our own identities as parents, where it matters more that our kids want to be close to us. Like in the past with the community, parents would be out playing
Yeah,
mahjong or doing their thing. And there was a real distinction. It was like, okay,
right.
whatever, like if my kid doesn't like me that much, but now it's like, I need my kid to adore me. Otherwise, I'm a failure as a parent.
No, it's absolutely right. There was a survey at the University of Virginia in 2012 that said parents, raising children want and expect to be best friends with their
Yeah.
with their. I don't think my parents. I was blessed with good parents that I liked, but I don't think they expected to be my best friend, and I don't think they cared that much about what I thought about them.
Right. Mine neither.
Right. I once heard the comedian Jon Stewart say that. He said, "I was raised in the generation of you're nothing so special generation." you know, I mean, I was raised in a middle class Jewish home, so I was sort of raised with a feeling of being special. But
Yeah.
you know, but um, but our generation wasn't typically raised in that sort of way. We were still raised, maybe the last generation raised with the idea that you have to respect your elders, and
Mm.
even though our generation of parents, when I say our, I mean like boomer parents, they were guided by Dr. Spock. So Dr. Spock was much more like, think about having a good relationship with your children. He was different from the behaviorists that preceded him, who were much more rigid in terms of their parenting ideals. But all of that is, now it's Dr. Spock on steroids in terms of what parents are supposed to be, in terms of best friends and close and accepting and thinking constantly about whether their interventions are hurtful to their children or is it going to ruin the relationship. I mean, I'm often asked in interviews, well, by anxious journalists, well, what can I do to prevent my kids from later estranging me? And I say, well, first thing is don't get divorced. Second is
All right, and
make
nobody in this can help with that. Oh well.
Yeah. Second of all, make sure your kid marries somebody who's not going to turn them against you, which you have no
Mm.
control over. Make sure they don't get involved with a shitty therapist who assumes every problem they've got in adulthood comes from childhood trauma. Make sure they don't develop a mental illness. I already say that. I mean, there's a bunch of things that are completely outside of parents' control, tragically.
And
Uh,
that's so important to note, is that we blame ourselves. There's still, like we said at the beginning, like we blame ourselves, like it must be me
right.
that caused a kid to turn away from me. And I'm glad that you noted there's so many other factors involved.
Yeah, and that's an okay default when you're raising your children, that will let me think if there's something else that I could be doing or should be doing. But particularly once your children are adults, that can be really problematic, belief system to have in place if your children have turned against you and they're not willing to accept an amends letter, accept any form of reconciliation or work on the relationship. At that point, it isn't very adaptive or useful to keep thinking about, oh, what should I be doing differently or could I be doing differently? At some point, you have to just accept that it is the way that it is. If you've done all the steps that I think parents need to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So what about, are there any misconceptions people have regarding estrangement or alienation where they're just like, oh, well, that would never happen to me?
Yeah, well, that's why I was saying, yeah, don't get divorced. I mean, I'm divorced. Say this with, I have no criticism of anybody who's divorced. Yeah, I wanted for the longest time to write an article with the title something like, "Dear Millennials, your children may estrange you one day too."
Mm.
Because so many in that generation seem to be so kind of self-righteous, quite frankly, that, well, I would never treat my child the way you treated me. And it's like, well, maybe you wouldn't, but you may be faced with other challenges that you haven't anticipated either. Your kid may develop a mental illness. They may become an addict. They may marry somebody who turns them against you. And they may get involved with a therapist who blames you for all of their problems and says that estrangement is the best path. So there's a lot of pathways to estrangement beyond parental abuse or neglect.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, not everything is your fault.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Right. A minority.
Yeah. So another thing that is pretty interesting is people who are in these situations and want to reconcile with their children or adult children. Um, Something you said is that your child is the one that holds the power, which is interesting because in a friend relationship, it's more like, well, you have to think about my feelings. How is it different in these kinds of situations between an adult and a child, whether they're an adult child or anything?
Yeah. It's complicated with minors, so to make it simple, we'll just talk about adult children, because once a child is a full-fledged adult, you have very little power or influence over them.
Mhm.
So you kind of have to be thinking about what kind of a relationship do they want with you. You might want to be besties with them, but they may not want to be besties with you. Or they might be open to having a close relationship with you, but you might have to be much more sympathetic to their version of their childhoods than you really feel. And you may have to need to find a way to be empathic to what their experience was, even if that's greatly at odds with yours. Because again, to repeat, nothing compels an adult child to have a relationship with a parent beyond that adult child's desire to. The old days of honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, you owe your parents. That ship has sailed. So parents can't guilt their kids back into contact. It has to be, they have to sort of make it seem appealing to them to be back in contact.
Yeah, yeah. It's more like we want it as adults, we want it more
We do.
than our kids want it.
We do. And the sociologists call that the intergenerational stake, the idea that, yeah, parents are much more motivated than the child is. You can think about your own experience. Like I said, I was blessed with parents that I liked, but I always knew when I visited them or called them that it was much more meaningful to
Mhm,
them than it
mhm.
to me. Now that I have adult children and a grandchild, they're front and center of my consciousness, but I don't assume I'm front and center for them. Hopefully they want to spend time with me. Typically they do. Um, but it's very different. It's just not the same thing.
Yeah. What about, and this is something that happens all the time that we see, is when there's been a rift between a child and a parent, and then the parent is saying, well, I want to fix things, I want to mend things, and the child is talking to them, and the child says, well, let me tell you my perspective. And then they start saying all of these things that happen that aren't true.
Yeah,
um, the parent is like, that just didn't happen, or your perspective is completely warped. One of the mistakes we see parents making in our communities, they're like, I need to correct
right.
my child's perspective. Can you address that? Again, doesn't matter the age of the kid, but when someone's saying, this is how I feel, this is my perspective, and you're like, that's complete, you're crazy. Like,
Right.
I need to first correct your what you're
Yeah, it's
saying.
human nature.
How does that go?
Yeah, go wrongly accused, it's human nature to want to correct it and to say, no, you just misunderstand. That wasn't what I was thinking or feeling. If a kid says, well, you were gone all the time in my childhood, a parent might want to say, yeah, I had to work two jobs to put you through college, give me a break. How come I don't get credit for that?
Mm-hmm.
It's not the right place to come from. Even though one can be completely sympathetic to the parent, the child at that point really needs the parent to just understand what it was like for them as a child, and to be able to say, yeah, it sounds like that was really hard for you. Tell me more about that. What did you feel? Or what did you think when I was at work? Or how do you wish it had been? That's often where the healing comes in, is the parent's capacity to be curious and empathic, and even more to take responsibility. But part of what's challenging for parents, there was an important study by the Australian psychologist Nick Haslam a few years ago, and he said that, in the past 3 decades, there's been this enormous creep in terms of what we label abusive, traumatic, harmful, neglectful behavior. So younger generations have been reared in a culture where behavior that older generations would not have considered harmful, abusive, neglectful behavior. And so what often happens is that the adult child will now come to the parent and say, well, I've learned in therapy that that was emotional abuse, or that was emotional insult. You traumatized me, or you hurt me, or and the parents like, what are you talking about? You know, I would have killed to have your had your
Right. Right.
child, right? Which of course doesn't cause the child to feel very understood. So it's far better. I mean, I don't think if a parent knows they didn't molest their child, I don't think a parent should say, yes, there's some way that I can empathize with that. They can say, well, I can tell you with 100% authority that I didn't do that because I'm not capable of molesting any child, particularly my own. But I also know, and then they have to pivot back to the child's experience and say, but I also know that sometimes people remember things in a certain way because they're trying to surface other things about the relationship that didn't feel good. Or they can say, but I'm also willing to do due diligence. If you'd like to meet with me with a sex abuse therapist, I'm open to doing that. Just make sure it's somebody who actually knows that topic. But most of the other complaints, I think there's a way for parents to say something like, well, it's clear that I had blind spots that I wasn't aware that that felt emotionally abusive to you, but I'm glad you let me know because that's something we can work on together in therapy. Would you be open to telling me more about whatever memories you have? Not so the parent can refute them, but so they can just have a deeper understanding of the child's perspective. Now, again, if it's a memory that the parent, even if it's not, something as powerful as sex abuse, it's some, or physical abuse, it's some other thing. A parent can say, well, I don't really recall it that way, but I could be wrong, and if your memory does serve you right, well, of course you would have been upset. So the main thing is to get it out of the realm of argumentation, because that's where defensiveness comes in, and nobody's open to another person when they feel defensive, they feel shut down. So you want to communicate in a way that causes your child to feel like, oh, you really care about me. You do care about my perspective, even if it's at odds with yours. And this is hard work. This is not something you can just sort of,
Yep.
just
Oh,
turn
yeah.
on. It's really challenging to do, but it's also critical to do because nothing happens unless it happens.
Yeah, yeah. So I was going to say, you mentioned like approaching from a perspective of being curious, like tell me more, and also being really empathic, even when it feels counterintuitive, like they're wrong. But I think it involves a lot of self-control and restraint. Are there any other tips for people whose kids have turned from them so that they feel like this is not the end and it's never going to get better? Because we've seen things turn around, but I know for people, as you do very much more than I do, that they feel like this is it. Like they've either, for our clients, like, oh, my 18-year-old's aged out of the system, like the law can't do anything. It's been years of this. Like, I feel like they're just gone and I should just give up.
Yeah. I mean, statistically, the most recent study says that something like 80% of mothers are eventually reconciled with their children, and 69% of fathers are. And of course, there's lots of variation in
Wow.
between. But, in general, the majority eventually reconcile. We just don't know when they're going to reconcile. And so, what I always tell people is that you want to have one foot in radical acceptance and one foot in hope. You can't white knuckle it through life. So radical acceptance is like, okay, I've done everything right. I've reached out to my child. I've taken responsibility. I've written an amends letter. I've really tried to understand their perspective. I've worked on not being defensive. I've offered therapy. At this point, I'm not going to just ruin my life hoping that they're going to come back. There's a saying, which I think comes from mindfulness, which is pain plus struggle equals suffering. The more that we fight against a feeling, the more we tell ourselves that it's intolerable, the louder it gets, the more they can kind of go, yeah, this sucks and this hurts and I'm really sad about it and I feel scared. But just accept that can be a pathway towards just feeling better. But at the same time, to have some degree of hope, kind of like, well, but a lot of these kids do come back and maybe mine will eventually, and hopefully they will, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add, and if not, then tell people how they can find you and about your books on this topic.
Well, the only other thing I would say is that, I think what the larger media doesn't spend enough time on, because often I'm asked by journalists or producers, well, when should a kid cut, adult child cut a parent off? And, what I'll say is I'm always willing to answer that question. But the more important thing to highlight is that when an adult child cuts off a parent, even if we would all agree that, yeah, I could see why, it's still a cataclysmic event in the family system. Grandparents get typically cut off from grandchildren, even loving, dutiful grandparents who spent a lot of years raising the child. If there's conflict between the adult child and the grandparent gets denied access. That's incredibly tragic. It can negatively impact the marriage if the parents are still together. It can cause siblings to line up, some for the estranged adult child, some with the parents. Aunts and uncles may step in and assume a parental role that's problematic in the family system. So it creates enormous havoc and disruption in family systems. And so it's not a trivial event. There's so much written these days about, mostly from the adult child's perspective, about why I needed to cut off a parent. There's value in it. Again, I'm not saying that there's no place for that. But what's missing in these narratives is the parents' perspective, how miserable they are, how heartbroken they are, how
Hmm.
lost they feel, how much they feel like how am I going to even go on and have life without my child or grandchildren in it. And it's partly because parents aren't really writing these first person essays because they don't want to expose themselves to their child saying, oh, now you're writing about this in public, you're feeling sorry for yourself or whatever. So there's a sort of
Hmm.
disparity in the narratives that's in the public. So I just think as a society we have to do a much better job with this. So anyway, so people can
And I
find
was going
me.
to say, so where can people get support if they? I mean, for me as a writer too, it's very healing to write. Of course, you can keep things to yourself, but a lot of people write and they use social media as a type of therapy because they want to attract other people in their situation to give them support.
Yeah,
How can people find support for issues like this?
yeah. Well, I have on my website, www.drjoshuacoleman.com. I have a private Facebook group for estranged parents and grandparents. Just make sure you answer all the questions when you apply, because my moderators are very, very picky. So make sure of that. I do a free Q&A every other Monday at 11:30 a.m. Pacific, which you can also discover through my free newsletter, which you can also sign up for at my website. And there's other Facebook groups for estranged and alienated parents. But getting support is critically important because it's really easy to feel like you're the only parent going through this when there are really, at this point, seems like millions of parents going through it. So
Yeah.
support is really critical.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much. I love getting your newsletter. I popped into your queue and I was like, whoa, boom, boom, boom. There are so many people dealing with this.
Yeah,
And it is, and everyone in it feels like they're the only one. You're right.
yeah.
Yeah. But I so appreciate you taking the time to do this between that super busy schedule.
No, happy to. Thanks for having me on. It was fun.
All right. Take care. Bye.